All right, we are live. Welcome to the War Elephant Podcast, Editor's Pick, Episode 1. This is Ian.
And I'm Casey.
And we're here to sort of get the ball rolling on a project we've been thinking about for several months now. Why don't you introduce yourself, Casey?
Well, I'm the editor-in-chief for War Elephant, which is a job that I kind of have been working towards all my life, I guess. I am a writer and a teacher. I've taught at pretty much every level from preschool to college. I'm a trained chemist. I went to graduate school in both chemistry and cancer biology. And I'm also a musician, which you'd never guess with the instruments in the back there. And I just have a wide variety of interests and love learning.
And currently I do administrative office type work in a medical setting, but I trained as an English teacher. I've taught in both high school and community college level. I am a former musician. I still play a little bit, but I've never played professionally, and I stopped doing anything really serious after college. But I do have a deep appreciation of music, especially of the classical variety. But I have a more vibrant and current passion for literature, both classic, your Shakespeare's, your Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, but also the pop culture. So Batman, Sherlock Holmes, what I would call the modern archetypes of the knight in the modern context. Let's talk a little bit about the War Elephant. You mentioned that you're the chief editor. I am an editor under you, which is another position. What do we do at the War Elephant, Casey?
Well, we are a media company, just starting up, really. We cover a wide variety of conservative and military-related positions, mostly thoughtful analysis of what's going on in the world, and look at things from perspectives that people don't usually get in today's soundbite entertainment, drive-by news flashes. We've got a whole team of editors. We've got an entire team of people looking for conservative viewpoints and voices, and we try to get those voices out there to people so that they can think about the issues in more thoughtful ways.
Well, and specifically, we exist as a media company, but we're also a community. So we've developed both a Discord platform and a Quora platform, and we're working on our own website so that we can host our own content. Because right now, the terms and services of the various platforms that we use, like Twitter and Quora and Facebook, they're limiting. So we have to do a lot of self-censoring, and we want to have more freedom. So one of the things that we're doing with this podcast is attempting to create content to really bolster what's available on our own website that's not available elsewhere. So this podcast will be conversations with KC and I and many of our other editors and other positions in the company. And of course, if there are fans who start joining the community and have interesting perspectives, we'll be happy to talk about that. We'll probably also try and seek out some people who disagree and see if we can have useful and productive conversations rather than debates. We're not really interested in those.
We really are focused on giving a voice to conservative writers.
Yeah.
And conservative thinkers who are finding it hard to get a voice and traction in a lot of areas. And they have a lot to say and a lot of interesting things. And when I say conservative, it covers a gamut of ideas that people maybe don't think of as conservative. Because we have everything from people who consider themselves pretty firmly in the Democratic Party to paleoconservatives to libertarians writing for us. But what they all appreciate is that we have a strong commitment to allowing them to express their ideas within our conservative traditions.
And another thing is, as editors, our job is to really curate and promote the voice of our community. We really want to focus on conservative issues and military perspectives and history, which are things that are often underlooked on most social media platforms just because of the demographic and political biases of the producers and the main content creators on those platforms. So that's our goal. But also, we're very much of the opinion that conservatism isn't a monolith. And
Yes.
but it's not anything goes. So there are things that are not conservative and there are things that are conservative. And so what I'm particularly interested in doing on the podcast is really trying to not set walls up, but sort of shift the Overton window of our community in a way that's a bit easier to do in a verbal exploration rather than trying to lay out a really logical piece by piece written article. And I think multiple perspectives really help you to explore the boundaries of the Overton window in an easily digestible and accessible way that is just harder to do in a written format like letter. Not at all to denigrate formats like letter. I think it would be great if we had some writers who worked on letter for War Elephant. But the letter format is constricted and it's very hard. Whereas a podcast is a more free-flowing discussion. And I'm hoping that we can have a lot of really productive conversations that show the differences within conservatism while still remaining firmly a conservative voice.
And also, not everyone's a reader.
Yes.
We're book people, but a lot of people aren't book people. And sometimes you just like to listen to something. Sometimes you've got a chance to listen while you're out walking or driving, and you can't pick up a tablet or a phone or a book and read.
Or you shouldn't. Please don't be reading while driving, guys.
Yes, please don't. We strongly disapprove of reading and driving.
So there's a couple stories that we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, both of which we have highlighted and sort of been talking about in our community, on our Discord server, and on the Quora, which is sort of our main hub right now. The first is the United States government has blocked 4 companies and a manufacturing facility in China's Xinjiang province, which is most famous for being the place, the home of the ethnic and religious group, the Uyghurs. They're a primarily Muslim religious group, and they're a separate ethnic group from Han, which is the primary, the dominant majority population of China. And they've always been sort of not in favor with the government of China because they're so different ethnically and religiously. But in recent years, they've really been cracked down upon. There's a lot of very compelling reports of disappearances, political prisoners, forced sterilizations, terror tactics used by government against its own citizens, slave labor. And slave labor is the reason this action's been taken by the U.S. Customs and Border institution. So,
and
Casey,
this is within a larger context of his history of the Chinese government oppressing religious and ethnic minorities. So there's nothing surprising that the government of China has been instituting this, but what is surprising about their actions against the Uyghurs is just how large of a scale and systemic these abuses have been. And we now have evidence from drone footage and from internal footage in camps now that they've been putting people into camps for re-education purposes and for forced labor.
and to give an idea of the scale, the numbers that we're getting are on the order of 1 million or more, which I know that China has well over 1 billion people in it, but 1 million people is a staggering number to put into a forced labor camp or a re-education camp. It's just a phenomenal tragedy and barbarity by the Chinese government. And we at the War Elephant have really been worked up about things like the abuses in Hong Kong and the aggressions that China has taken towards its neighbors like Australia and Taiwan, and its use of its influence in rogue nations like North Korea. But I have a connection as a child to the Uyghurs. My doctor, my family physician, the man who, was the person who checked up on my health when I was a kid. He felt a real burden to be a medical, to be of medical service to the Uyghurs in China. And he spent, I think, at least a decade there really working. And of course, he was forced out because China didn't want any witnesses from the West, particularly. But he was forced out. But because of that connection, I've always felt a real burden that this population that's often, very oppressed and doesn't have a lot of resources technologically, medically, educationally. It's just not a very integrated portion of one of the most powerful nations on earth. And now they're being enslaved and tortured. And I think that's really bothersome to me that is happening again. And of course, both of us, I'm in my 30s and Casey's a little older than that. So we've lived through Rwanda. We've lived through Kosovo. We've lived through, what's happening in North Korea and has been happening since the 50s. So it's not that we're not aware of many other genocides and genocide adjacent actions by brutal governments. But this one, it has that personal connection for me. So I'm very, very glad that the U.S. is taking real action that's targeted at these behaviors by the Chinese government.
And, Ian, I did not know about that personal story. And that is really compelling. For me, of course, it calls to mind the actions of the German government. And I know I've told you about this before, but my great-grandmother, her entire family was placed in extermination camps. And that entire branch of my family tree is just gone. She was from Bohemia, and her family were Jewish and Gypsies, and they're gone. And I can't help but think, here's another religious and ethnic minority being forced through the exact same kind of conditions, and it makes my blood run cold. And it seems like there's a willingness to just overlook it by so many people. And of course, you think there's so many problems in the world and it's half a world away. But when the products of their work come to our shores, when the things that they make, because they're forced to make them in these camps, come, and then we can buy them and you don't know you're buying them, that's very disturbing. So I'm really glad that the Customs and Border Patrol used the 1930 Act that was enacted to stop this kind of exploitative practice and unfair trade practice.
And of course, this is brand new action by the U.S. government. And so, of course, we can't know what the effect will be. And I hope that it's continued. This is not necessarily a top voting issue for me, but it's definitely a voting issue for me. The stance that the various senators and president and representatives will take towards China is important to me. And I very much hope that our government, no matter who wins the election in November, will continue to behave ethically towards the people of China so that they do not support the slave labor of this population. or any population. I mean, it's not just the Uyghurs who, I mean, there have been reports since the 90s of political prisoners being forced to produce goods, and even organ donation, like organ farms of political prisoners. So it's not just the Uyghurs, it's just that the Uyghurs have been really systematically used by the Chinese Communist Party in the last 10 years or so.
And this touches on one thing that conservatives kind of get tied up in, and that is free trade and fair trade, and what constitutes free and fair trade and unfair trade practices. And the 1930 Tariff Act bans the use of slave and forced labor in order as an unfair trade practice. And it calls to question what kind of responsibility should we have for having trade with companies and with countries that engage in these kinds of practices. And is it more important as a conservative to be committed to fully free trade, or to be aware that free trade isn't really free when it comes at the cost of unfair trade practices?
And that actually is a really good segue into our second topic of the night, which is the Netflix film Cuties. And the segue for me is that Netflix is an American company. And of course, Cuties is a French film, originally called Mignon. But it's being promoted and it's being distributed by Americans. And I think that we need to have just as sharp an eye on American companies as we do on Chinese government and company practices. So I'm sure most people are aware of the Cuties controversy. For anyone who isn't or is not fully aware, it's a French film made for film festival. It's very much trying to get awards. It's trying to be one of those serious films. 11 years old, the character and the actress were both 11, who is really struggling at home because her father is marrying a second wife. And she acts out by joining basically a gang of bullies. It's some French girls, and they're not ethnically French. There's a lot of ethnic diversity in this gang of girls that she joins, but they're all uniformly self-destructive in their actions, in their behavior. They're bullying, they're manipulative, they steal. Some of them are physically violent towards each other. It's just very unhealthy. And the controversy mostly stems from the fact that the marketing and the film itself display these, again, literally 11-year-old children who are the actresses playing the parts of these characters in extremely sexual, provocative ways in their dancing and other situations. There's some very disturbing scenes of these girls acting in sexual ways. So Casey, what was your take on this when you first heard about it? And now that it's sort of just exploded, what do you think we should think about, both as conservatives and just as people?
I didn't want to rush to judgment. I never really liked to do that when I first heard about it, especially with theater. I'm heavily involved in the theater, and there's a lot of ways to handle children in the theater so that you can protect their innocence and still convey things that need to be conveyed, even disturbing things. But as more has come out and I've seen more and more about this film and talked to more people, I have come to seriously wonder why this film was produced the way in which it was, even though it sounds like the message that it's trying to portray ultimately wasn't necessarily a bad one.
I mean, a lot of people have been asking me this question: who was this made for? Why was it made this way? It was made for film festival audiences, and it was made for that specific level of, you could call it jaded or you could call it experienced viewer. And this is the same community that gave a standing ovation to Roman Polanski winning an Oscar in 2003.
But they
This is
used real children.
yes, but it's the same. Roman Polanski raped a real 13-year-old girl.
This is true.
This
And they still don't
community,
seem to care.
right? This community has a very serious problem being able to distinguish art from what I would say is abuse.
Yeah.
And I think Netflix as a company is complicit by releasing and promoting this film. Not just how they promote it, but the very fact that they're releasing and promoting it at all. When we were preparing our show notes for this episode, you had some really good thoughts about why it's specifically a problem. Because both of us would agree it's perfectly legitimate to talk and have dramatic stories with live action, real actresses, real child actresses and actors dealing with difficult subjects, dealing with hard subjects. So why do you think Cuties is specifically wrong in the way that it portrays these hard issues?
First of all, it's because it invites you to look at these children specifically in a very sexual manner. In the way that the people who exploit children look at them. And you can't escape it. That's a choice of cinematography. You wouldn't normally, a healthy person wouldn't normally focus on certain aspects of a child's body, even if they're dancing. And children dance in provocative ways all the time now. And there's been a lot of criticism about that. There's been criticism about it when it's just in dance troupes, whether it's school associated or not, whether it has to do with shows like Dance Moms or the children's beauty pageants. It's been a lot of criticism about sexualization of children. But my mom loved to watch Dance Moms. And when they would show it up on a stage from way back in the audience, and the children would be dancing, and you would see the whole child. And so they would focus up on a child, but they would focus on the whole child. When Cuties is shot, they focus up on parts of the children's body that pretty much demand you view them as a sexual object. And this is not how you, the viewer, whether you're male or female, should be looking at an 11-year-old child, period. Even if their point is, look, these children are being looked at by other people this way. The film could have found a more delicate way to make that point. It didn't need to go there.
Yeah, I mean, you've really highlighted the tools. In film, there's a lot of talk about subjectivity of a shot, and a wide shot where you're talking about seeing the whole stage is objective because it's you see everything. So you see things as a whole. The closer you get to an actor or actress is considered more subjective because it gives you only a part. It's narrowing their perspective. It's focusing what you do. And cinematography is a very deliberate thing. Even when the camera is really moving and it's hard to see, the audience has a hard time. The person operating the camera and the director are very deliberate in what's happening in front of the camera, where the camera is, what your eyes are going to be drawn to. There's whole many studies, and all directors and cinematographers are very well trained in how to put things in certain parts of the field of the camera so that your eye will be drawn to them. And the way they filmed these girls, it's not an accident, it's not objective, it is subjectively designed to make us look at these girls dancing in a sexual way, which again, they took real girls under puberty and taught them to dance this way.
And not just dance, but touch each other sexually.
Yeah.
in very, very provocative sexual ways. And they didn't need to film any of this directly. They could have made the suggestions, and we would have all gotten the point. I love old movies. I just love old movies. And they do innuendo so well. You know, Cole Porter songs are full of innuendo. And of course, he touched on all kinds of forbidden relationships of his day, and everybody knew what he was talking about. You know, and it was a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And you knew 100% of what was going on, and it just was just fine. You laughed, you enjoyed it, you might have been titillated, but you weren't forced to see it.
Well, something else you mentioned when we were preparing is when you show something, and you brought up specifically the theory of the male gaze and objectification, which are feminist film concepts. And I wouldn't consider myself a feminist, but I think there is good scientific evidence that there is a real thing happening when people, especially male, but also all people, look at various things, especially sexually.
Yes.
And it's a physiological, it's an involuntary response. And when that happens, something called objectification happens, because you stop having a relationship with the person and you start having a response to an object.
That's right.
When you imply, when you do what Cole Porter was doing and you let people figure it out, but you don't show it, I think it is a healthier relationship, because instead of having that involuntary response, you're actually engaging with the minds of the characters in the relationship with each other. So you have to imagine yourself and your empathy with them and what they're feeling. And that's a relationship. It's not an object.
Yes, exactly.
So I actually think that what Cuties is talking about is a completely legitimate and very good thing to talk about. I think how to talk about it is very important, and I think Cuties completely fails in any moral or ethical judgment in doing so responsibly. I think it subjected these actresses to unethical training.
Yes.
And I think it subjects the audience to completely unacceptable, subjective, and deliberate sexualization of children.
Yes, I agree with all of the above. And one of the destructive things, and I brought it up, was about pornography, about strip clubs, about going to these sexualized shows, was they retrain you to stop thinking not only about the individual who's dancing as a human being, a complete human being. And I know people will say, oh, I think of the dancer that way, but they don't. They don't, because when they talk about them, they clearly quit talking about them as a human being. They give lip service to it, but they don't. And they think about them as less. They think about them as an object, and then they start thinking about other women. And there's a lot of studies on why sexual violence goes up with people who watch a lot of pornography, who go to strip clubs, who solicit sex as a paid service. And it has to do with this objectification. And they wind up viewing largely women, but also somewhat to another degree men, whoever they're using as sexual objects, as non-humans. And this show forces that animal part, that animal part of our brains, the viewer, into that mindset. And it's just not somewhere we should be going.
And I think it's really disturbing that we've really been pushing this for kids through some things you were mentioning, like the dance shows and the beauty pageants for children. And something I've noticed a lot recently, just this burlesque-esque children involved in a burlesque-esque activity under the guise of some kind of activism. And I think that it's deeply anti-child. And I think that it's, I'm not sure entirely where I fall in terms of legalization of things like prostitution and strip clubs and so forth, because that gets into individual choice and other conservative philosophical principles. But when it comes, I think as a personal matter, these things aren't healthy. Whether they should be legal or not is another question, but I think they're not healthy for adults to engage in. When you put a child in this situation, it becomes way more than unhealthy. I think it becomes evil. And
Yeah, I agree.
And so I thought it was worthwhile, since these things are really current. I mean, this legislation about I think it's actually a policy or an executive order or something. It's not through Congress about the Uyghurs. And then this movie Cuties has really been taking the internet and conversation by storm, rightly so. I just wish there was more agreement. I don't think that it should be a conservative versus liberal issue that you shouldn't be filming kids dancing in a sexual way. I don't think that should be liberal or conservative. But sadly, it's sort of turned into that. So I'm hoping that our bit of the conversation can sort of help people in the middle see it doesn't matter if you're wanting to vote for Biden or Trump. Both sides should be against this. I'm
kind of wondering where the Me Too movement is on this, to be honest.
Well, that's a whole nother podcast, which we will do in the future. But I wanted to give a couple plugs. Our founder of the War Elephant, John Davis, just did a podcast today about toxic masculinity, and that's over on the Stoa channel on YouTube. The podcast is called Postscript, and he did a dialogue with Buster Benson. Definitely want to check that out. John Davis is a great writer and thinker. We also have the War Elephant Space on Quora, the War Elephant server on Discord, and we're going to have a War Elephant website, which we're going to be really pushing through this podcast and other places. So hopefully you'll join us again next week. And in the meantime, this has been the editor's notes. Oh, sorry. This has been Editor's Pick, a War Elephant podcast, episode 1.
You're renaming us. Thank you very much, Ian.
All right. Thanks, Casey.